Session 2. The Heart of His Mystery. Nick of the Woods, the Quaker Gothic and the Frontier. So welcome to this lecture. I'll start with some interesting pictures. On the left we have an illustration from the German edition of the novel from 1883, and on the right we have a picture of the author Robert Montgomery Bird. A couple of things to note about the illustration on the left. Obviously it's a scene of violence, as befits what is actually a very violent novel, but also note what the character of Nick of the Woods is wearing. He's dressed in Native American garb, which is important when we consider both the treatment of Native Americans in the story, but also the blurring of the boundaries between what is supposed to be savagery and civility, and that's an important aspect of the story. So the plan of the lecture: I'll start with a brief biography of Robert Montgomery Bird. I'll then move on to a recap of session 1. I just want to draw out once again some of the themes that we touched on in the first session and how they might be of relevance to this session when we look at the novel in much more detail. I'll then talk a little bit about the Gothic mode in literature, which is clearly important to Nick of the Woods. Then I will talk about the importance of the frontier in American history, culture, and indeed literature, then combine these two to talk about something which has become known as the Frontier Gothic. To finish off, a slightly unwieldy label, but one which I hope I can be forgiven for, the Quaker Frontier Gothic, and an examination of how we might apply that label to Nick of the Woods. I'll then finish off with a brief mention of the other tasks that I would encourage you to complete in this session, and a bibliography of suggested reading if you want to explore this any further. So to start with the biography of Robert Montgomery Bird, I should say that this is fairly brief. I'm just drawing attention to the most important, the most relevant events in his life. There are biographies out there of the author. There is various information available also online if you want to find out any more about him. So he was born in Delaware on the 5th of February 1806 to a pioneer family. His father was a partner in Bird and Riddle, who were fairly successful government Navy agents. But his father died when Robert was 4, and so Robert moved with his mother and his brothers to Philadelphia to live with a rich uncle, whose name was Nicholas Van Dyke, in an area called Newcastle. He attended Newcastle Academy and after that Germantown Academy, then graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in 1824. He started to write short poems and fiction during medical school. And by 1827 he'd published items in Philadelphia Monthly Magazine, along with 2 dramatic comedies, 'Twas All for the Best and News of the Night. Now he actually tried to start a medical practice. He was trained as a doctor, but left after 1 year to pursue his literary career. Primarily he was a playwright at first. He wrote plays for the actor Edwin Forrest, some of which, for example The Gladiator, which was produced in 1831, went on to be extremely successful. But the relationship with Forrest turned rather sour, allegedly. Forrest had promised to pay Bird extra money if any of the plays did become successful. But this money apparently was not forthcoming, so Bird, in frustration, disgust, turned to novels. And these are perhaps what he's most famous for now. The novels include Calabar, 1834, The Infidel, 1835, The Hawks of Hawk Hollow, 1835, Shepherd Lee in 1836, Nick of the Woods in 1837, which is probably his most successful novel, The Adventures of Robin Day in 1839, and a final novel, A Belated Revenge, finished by his son, Frederick M. Bird, in 1889. Bird was also a journalist. He edited the North American Magazine and United States Gazette from 1847. He did, in fact, teach medicine at Pennsylvania Medical College and also ran for Congress in 1842, although this bid for Congress was actually, in the end, unsuccessful. In fact, I think he aborted it before it even came to the end. He died on the 23rd of January 1854. The reason given was a brain effusion. So we can see that Byrd had quite a prolific career in a relatively short life. He tried his hand at many things, some of them literary, some not. But he certainly leaves behind quite a varied range of literary texts for people to analyse. But like I said, Nick of the Woods is the one that's attracted probably the most critical interest and was probably his most successful text. Just to step back to session 1 briefly. Like I said, I'd like to draw out some of the ideas which I think are of particular relevance here. The first of which is the obvious one, that we are partly concerned on this module with depictions of Quaker characters. So we saw last week 4 short texts, and we discussed some of the issues that came from them. And one of them, for example, was a discussion of Letters from American Farmer, which had a depiction of a Quaker character called John Bertram. Now, obviously, we have a very different Quaker character in this novel. John Bertram was kind, benevolent, gentle. What we have here is something altogether different. I'd also like to draw your attention again to the quotation from John Woolman's journal. I found it safest for me to live in private and keep these things sealed up in my own breast. Now this, of course, is partly to do with Quaker theology and Quaker worship, waiting on the still small voice to move us to speak. And it's about the testimony of silence. But what is interesting, as I mentioned last week, is in the hands of non-Quaker writers, the Quaker character's dedication to silence and inwardness becomes a dedication to privacy, maybe even secrecy, and maybe even mystery, something which is altogether less benign, perhaps slightly threatening, but certainly very intriguing and very mysterious. And that's, as we'll see, what's going on in the depiction of Nathan Slaughter / Nick of the Woods in Robert Montgomery Byrd's novel. His Quaker inwardness becomes translated in the eyes of other characters into something more like mystery, something which could even be sinister. And these ideas of inwardness, things that remain hidden, things that get revealed, and that contrast between those two is very important to the Gothic. And the Gothic is something we'll explore much more in this session. So thinking about the Gothic is one of those modes of literature about which I think most people think they know a fair amount. Most people have certain sets of stereotypical Gothic elements very much to hand in their consciousness. We might think about old houses and castles, for example, in relation to the Gothic, and the term partly derives from Gothic architecture, an example of which we can see on the slide behind the words here. We might also think about the supernatural, or at least the possibility of the supernatural. We might think of the Gothic as associated with violence and horror and terror, with mania, dark psychological troubles, trauma perhaps. We might think of images of confinement, those houses and castles again, but also closets and dungeons. And we might think of monsters. The most famous of this, although it's actually a misnomer, is Frankenstein's monster. He's actually referred to as the creature in the novel. But certainly monsters, also vampires, these kind of things are familiar images of the Gothic. The Gothic is said to have started in England with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto in 1764, but it's important to note that it's a very international mode. There was German Gothic, French Gothic, and of course American Gothic. And many critics argue that the Gothic actually deals with culturally specific anxieties. Anxieties which are particular to a particular nation, a particular community, a particular group of people. The Gothic was very popular during the Romantic period, late 18th, early 19th century, and throughout the 19th century. And we can think of some of the most famous examples of Gothic literature: Frankenstein, Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde, from this period. But it's not just romance or escapism. It's about important ideas and debates. It's about the relationship between the past and the present. So the way perhaps that the past haunts the present, or elements of the past erupt into the present and disrupt the present. It's therefore also about tradition and about modernity, and about the fear of moving into modernity. Clearly it's about reason and the supernatural, but also reason and religion. If we think back to Charles Brockden Brown's Wieland that we touched on last week, that's very much about religious mania in a Gothic form. It's about gender relations, masculinity and femininity. It's very often about feminine subjugation at the hands of powerful men, about masculine power, masculine gender hierarchies in society. And it's about transgression, about moving across boundaries that you're not supposed to do, moving from acceptable behaviours to unacceptable behaviours, to dark, forbidden behaviours. And it's about the conscious and the unconscious. So we can see how all of these different themes might be adapted to particular locations and particular groups of people. And in America, Jeffrey Weinstock, who edited a collection of essays in 2017, which is in your bibliography on American Gothic, says the American literary tradition is at its core a Gothic one. This is a big claim. He's saying that the Gothic is extremely important right from the beginning of American literature. Obviously Wieland, late 18th century, but we can think about Edgar Allan Poe, who was big in the 19th century. Who very much wrote in a Gothic mode. And his early detective stories, like The Murders in the Rue Morgue, were also Gothic stories. Much later, we can think about Toni Morrison's Beloved, a story published in the 1980s about the legacy of slavery, which uses hauntings and Gothic violence to look at that relationship. Specifically in the American Gothic, I'm quoting here again from Charles Brockden Brown in his preface to Edgar Huntley. He promises terrors and delights, quote, peculiar to ourselves as Americans. There will be no more Gothic castles and chimeras, but instead incidents of Indian hostility and the perils of the Western wilderness. In other words, we're getting away from European Gothic with its castles to something more specifically, characteristically American, and that includes Indian hostility and the wilderness. So we can see here where Robert Montgomery Bird is coming from with Nick of the Woods. This is a Gothic story with certainly got Gothic elements set on the frontier, the border between civilization and wilderness. To quote Weinstock again at the bottom here, while far from all-inclusive, anxieties and desires related to God, the devil, and the legacy of Puritanism, the frontier, racial otherness and sexual otherness, and the capacity of individuals to draw logical and accurate conclusions based on sensory data are structuring preoccupations of the American Gothic tradition. So Weinstock is trying to list here characteristic elements of the American Gothic. There are lots of things that he mentions here. Obviously important for us is the frontier, which we're going to get to in more detail in just a moment. We might also mention the legacy of Puritanism. Obviously our task on this module is to talk about Quakerism, but clearly Puritanism was a very important aspect of American history which had a big influence on the literary and cultural production. But for our purposes here, the idea of the Gothic at the frontier is where we want to explore a little bit further. So, the frontier. I'm going to give you some quotations from The Significance of the Frontier in American History by Frederick Jackson Turner, which was first delivered as a lecture to a group of historians at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. It's a very important, hugely influential, and it has to be said, much critiqued essay on the importance of the frontier in forming, as Turner sees it, American identity. So I will read a few quotations from it and then provide some analysis of those quotations. So the first one, the existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. So in this quotation, Turner puts westward expansion across the continent at the heart of American development. Key word here, free land. So this is about claiming the wilderness, settling the wilderness, making what was once free land into settled land. Second quotation, the frontier is the line of most rapid and effective Americanization. The wilderness masters the colonist. It finds him a European in dress, industries, tools, modes of travel and thought. It takes him from the railroad car and puts him in the birch canoe. It strips off the garments of civilization and arrays him in the hunting shirt and the moccasin. So here we get Turner's idea that the frontier is what defines an increasingly American identity. The settler starts as a European and then becomes gradually more American as we progress westward and the frontier pushes back. Notice here, firstly, what have become, I guess, classic or stereotypical images of the frontiersman, the hunting shirt, the moccasin, but also notice how gendered this is. This is very much about frontiersmen with no mention of women. But the idea is that you get progressively more American in character as you pass westward. So similarly in the third quotation, at first the frontier was the Atlantic coast. It was the frontier of Europe in a very real sense. Moving westward, the frontier became more and more American. So he makes it very explicit in that quotation. And this idea of leaving Europe behind, finding a uniquely American identity is extremely important in the 19th century and beyond. We see it in the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who we're going to look at a little bit later on this course. We see it in Herman Melville's comments on Hawthorne's writing, where he talks about moving away from European models of literature to something that is more characteristically American. And this is what's going on in Turner's thesis. The further west we get, the more we push back the frontier, the more American we become in character. Turner also makes comments on Native Americans, and this is where things get more problematic. He says the effect of the Indian frontier as a consolidating agent in our history is important, and goes on to say, with reference to the Albany Congress, which took place in 1754, the powers of the General Council and the officers were chiefly the determination of peace and war with the Indians, the regulation of Indian trade, the purchase of Indian lands, and the creation and government of new settlements as a security against the Indians. In this connection may be mentioned the importance of the frontier from that day to this as a military training school, keeping alive the power of resistance to aggression and developing the stalwart and rugged qualities of the frontiersman. There's a lot to say about this. Firstly, we see here that negotiations, in fact probably subjugation, of the Native Americans are an important aspect of Turner's frontier thesis. He sees the frontier as military training school, so this is about conflict. And there's the strong suggestion here that the Native Americans are aggressors. So there's very much a binary distinction being set up here between the settlers and the Native Americans, and apparently precious little understanding, or certainly precious little acknowledgement of the fact that the settlers may well have been encroaching on land that the Native Americans had lived on for a very long time prior to the arrival of these settlers. And again, the very masculine, what has become very familiar image of the rugged frontiersman. So it's in these problematic negotiations, encounters with Native Americans, that again the character of the frontier and the frontiersman is developed in Turner's thinking. As I've said, Turner's frontier thesis has been much criticised in the last few decades by a group of historians called the New Western historians. who have found many weaknesses in Turner's account, and I'll briefly list some of them here. Firstly, they say that it's too linear. It describes a very straightforward movement from east to west. And when we arrive at the Californian coast, presumably the frontier is being pushed back as far as it can. But obviously, settling of the continent was much more haphazard than this. People moved in different directions. People settled in different places. Different groups were attracted to different regions. So recent critiques of Jackson Turner have looked at the history of the frontier in much more diverse and regional terms, not just as this straightforward progression from east to west. Part of the reason why Turner sees it in these terms is that his narrative is very triumphalist. It's the triumph of this emerging American identity. As we move further west, we become more American and our job is complete. So there's something very triumphalist about Turner's narrative, which again, more recent historians have pushed back against. And as I've already said, it's very masculine. There's no room here for frontiers women and children. It's very much about male domination of the environment, male domination of Native Americans, and is in that sense not very nuanced at all. And as we've said, it appears to endorse subjugation of the Native Americans, which are characterized as aggressive, even though at the same time, and this is characteristic of many depictions of Native Americans, they're actually quite romanticized. So when we see the frontiersmen wearing moccasins and traveling in a canoe, Turner is borrowing imagery from Native Americans, right? Maybe romanticizing their supposedly natural way of living at the same time as he is appearing to endorse their subjugation. Now, this strange tension we can also see in Nick of the Woods. Finally, the problem with Jackson Turner's frontier thesis is that he does not really acknowledge diversity. He talks as if there is a possibility of a singular American. But of course, we know that settlement throughout the continent was incredibly diverse. There were many different groups of people coming from many different parts of the world, settling in many different places. And his account, because he wants it to be linear and triumphalist, does not acknowledge this diversity. This is something that Robert Montgomery Bird explicitly deals with in Nick of the Woods. His frontier is a very diverse place, as this quotation from chapter 4 indicates. It is on the frontiers, indeed, where adventurers from every corner of the world and from every circle of society are thrown together, that we behold the strongest contrasts and the strangest varieties of human character. This is a book about extremes. It's a book about contrasts. And these contrasts are between people, but they're also within people. In the main character, Nathan, Nick of the Woods, we see the strongest contrast. And one of the interesting things about Nick of the Woods is exactly this, that it's showing the diversity of experience at the frontier and the conflicts and the clashes that emerge between different groups of people. So, many literary critics have explored the idea of the frontier Gothic, a particular type of Gothic literature which takes place in frontier locations, on the borders between civilization and wilderness. I've got a quotation here from Elizabeth Jane Wall Hines, who contributes an essay to Geoffrey Weinstock's collection that I mentioned earlier. She says, "The terrors of the other, both inside and outside the charmed circle of Satan and his minions, of uncanny doubles, objects and events that appear to or actually do violate the laws of nature, these and other Gothic features are enhanced at the frontier, a misty area in a hazily perceived border between the known world and the unknowable frightful wilderness. At the frontier, law and the safety of civic structures have no power. These are not the standard castles and spectres associated with British Gothic, but the kind of terrors hidden in a seemingly open landscape." So this is very interesting. The fact that the landscape is open does not mean that things cannot remain hidden. You may be able to see across distances, but that doesn't necessarily mean you'll understand what you are seeing. And what Hines is also suggesting in this essay is that the frontier might be a real place in the sense that it's, a border between wilderness and settled land, or a border between different communities, settler and Native American perhaps, but it's also a psychological entity. It's the border between that which is known and which is not known. And in Nick of the Woods and other similar novels, like Charles Brockden Brown's Edgar Huntley perhaps, the border between what is known and what is unknown is also an inner experience. It's the border between the self that we present to the world and the unconscious self, or it's the border between different selves in the same person. Now you can see where I'm going with this. This is obviously relevant to the character of Nathan Slaughter, Nick of the Woods. So the frontier is real and it's outside, but it's also psychological. It's also inside. The frontier is a projection of anxieties from people, from individuals. And on the frontier, which as we've seen is a very diverse place in Robert Montgomery Bird's writing, a place full of extreme and varied characters, this frontier seems to dramatize the fear of difference, the fear of people different from ourselves, but also the fear that we may not be quite the person we think we are. So it becomes a bigger question of identity. How do we know ourselves and how do we know others? And if we follow Jackson Turner in thinking that the frontier signifies becoming more American, then the idea of the frontier Gothic problematizes this. What does becoming more American mean? What can that identity possibly mean when we've got so many different types of people gathered here? When we can't even know ourselves, how can we possibly know what American actually means? So, a picture here again from one of the original printings of Nick of the Woods. We might think in terms of something called the Quaker frontier Gothic in talking about Nick of the Woods. And in the next slide, I'm just going to give a few little pointers as to what that might be. And these are the kind of things that we might discuss further in the discussion thread after this. So the themes of the novel. Clearly it's about savagism and civility. But as we've seen, the border between those two things, and borders are always blurring in the Gothic, becomes problematic. Someone who appears civil might turn out to behave very savagely. The novel is also about trauma and the psychological consequences of trauma. Think about the murder of Nathan's family, which gives some hint as to why he may behave the way he does. So it's also a story about revenge. It's also a story about landscape and land. The difference between free land, wilderness, and land which is owned and settled. It's about property. If we think of the story of disinheritance, which we have in the character of Roland, this suggests again the importance of property to the novel, and of course the importance of settler property versus Native American property. And it is, as I've suggested, a story about American identity. Remember, the strangest varieties of human character are found at the frontier. And this is a novel which is about a new nation, an emerging nation, a nation which is developing its character on the frontier and wondering what that character might turn out to be. In regard to this, Roland calls Nathan, in chapter 14, a strange fellow. He seems to affect mystery in all that concerns his own private movements. It is the character of his persuasion. This is interesting because I think what we're drawing attention here specifically to Nathan's Quakerism, his persuasion. Again, those familiar Quaker qualities, inwardness, silence, becomes to a character like Roland a mystery. Something that perhaps he is choosing to keep hidden. Something which may or may not be malevolent rather than benign. Now, as a note here, you might want to look for other references to mystery and inwardness in the novel, because there are many. I've got a long list of quotations related to this theme, and this might be something that you might want to go back and look for as well. But the important thing here is, characteristics which might be specifically Quaker in Nathan become something deeply mysterious to other characters. And we get this contradiction, this doubleness, and doubles are an important part of the Gothic. In chapter 36, Nathan is a warlike man of peace, the man-slaying hater of blood. He embodies that contradiction. So Nathan, stroke Nick, is a Gothic character. He's like Jekyll and Hyde, two conflicted personalities in one body. A double. Now ultimately, Nathan is too extreme. He's too outside the mainstream, and at the end of the story he has to stay in the woods. He can't return to civilization. He has to stay in the wild. Thinking back to the last session, John Bertram, I suggested that even a nice Quaker character like John Bertram, an idealized Quaker character like John Bertram, seems somehow outside the main progression of society. And we get the same thing here, much more extreme, in the character of Nick. So what I'm suggesting is that Nathan's Quakerism becomes a model for uncertainty about American character, the status of the other. It seems to ask, if even a Quaker can turn out to be a psychopathic killer, how on earth are we supposed to trust anybody? How on earth are we supposed to... I want to connect this to a very interesting quotation from a book by John P. McWilliams, which is called Hawthorne, Melville and the American Character. And the subtitle is A Looking Glass Business. I'll read the quotation then and try and gloss it for you. America and the Americans were becoming vacant mirror images of one another. So no one was quite sure whether the individual should be defined through the nation or the nation through the individual. Now this is important because it gets to the heart of the idea of democracy. Think about the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. But also, that is about uniqueness and individualism. What makes us the same is that we are all individuals. We are all unique. We are all different. We all have the freedom to practice religion as we wish. So there's a kind of possibly positive paradox at the heart of that. We are equal because we are all different. It raises a question, and this is where McWilliams uses the image of the mirror in his book. When I look at another American citizen, am I looking at a mirror image of myself because we are equal? Or am I looking at someone who is utterly different to me, perhaps even unknowable? Or am I looking at both? If I am therefore looking at both, does that mean that I am also unknowable? So I hope it's clear there's a kind of paradox there in that idea of equality and difference. And again, I think this is relevant to what's happening in Nick of the Woods, where we have this shock of finding. What I would like you to do next, if you can, is look at the group wiki, which I've also set up. Now here I've included a passage from the novel, which I'd like you to analyze together. So it's a group activity where you can add your own comments and edit those comments as you wish. But it's to think about what that passage tells us about the character of Nathan and what it tells us about the issues that we've talked about in the lecture and the bigger issues of the novel. I've also set up an open discussion thread where you can share some thoughts on the novel more generally and the ideas raised in this session. So I hope you will find these activities interesting. I hope The final thing to mention, of course, is the bibliography. Some of these are texts that I specifically mentioned in the lecture, such as John P. McWilliams's book and Geoffrey Weinstock's essay collection. But there are other things here which are about the frontier, about Robert Montgomery Bird's writing more generally, about the Gothic. So if you're interested in any of the ideas and issues raised in this session, there are plenty of articles and books there that you might go away and take a look at in your own time.